She was 32 and 11 weeks, a widow, when the men who owed her husband money paid her in keys. The men at the table laughed. There was no cash in it. No pension. No wagon. No lease past Michaelmas. No trade a woman could be paid to practice. One thing had come down to her from Thomas Hargreaves. A leather receipt book with a brass clasp, the corners worn pale, his hand on every page. He had been owed £96. What she was handed instead was the old brewery on the Burton Road, shut and quiet for 7 years. But what the estate agent did not know was that in the brick cellar under that brewery, behind the last row of casks, under a floor, a dozen men had walked across without once stopping. There was something that should not have been there. Something that would not only change what one widow was worth, it would change what every brewing house in Burton was willing to pay for a patch of wet Staffordshire ground. Before we go down those steps with her, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and whether anyone ever handed you something they swore was worthless. Eleanor Hargreaves had spent 9 years keeping other men's numbers straight, and not one of those men had ever thought of it as a skill. Her father, John Lyne, carted coal and lime out of Stapenhill for 26 years, and by the time Eleanor was 9, she could tell a loaded wagon from a half-loaded one by the sound the wheels made coming over the bridge. That was most of her education. Apart from 2 years at a little school kept by a woman named Prudence Cave, who taught her to write a fair hand and to hold a column of figures in her head. Her mother died when Eleanor was 14. Her sister Hannah married a boilerman and went to Derby and wrote twice in the first year, and after that not at all. She married Thomas Hargreaves in the spring of 1850, when she was 23 and he was 29. He had 2 wagons then and a share in a third, and 11 horses that he loved better than he loved most people, and a trade hauling malt and barley and coal and brick and empty casks between Burton and Derby and Lichfield. He could drive in the dark and mend a harness with wire and a knife. He could not keep a book to save his life, and within a year of the wedding, he had stopped pretending otherwise. So Eleanor kept them. Delivery receipts, invoices, wagon accounts, barrel tallies, unpaid bills, the toll book for the turnpike, the corn bills for the horses. She knew what an empty hogshead weighed, which was something near 80 pounds of oak and iron, and she knew that the same hogshead full of ale weighed better than 600, and she knew what that difference did to a wagon's springs on the hill out of Willington. She had never brewed anything in her life, and never expected to. What she understood was the paper that went with the beer, which is a different trade altogether, and a quieter one. In the November after they married, a wagon went over at Willington with a load of malt, and the merchant claimed there had been 14 sacks on it, and Thomas had delivered 12. Thomas had no answer. Eleanor did. She had the tally in her own writing, signed by the merchant's own man at the loading, and she carried it to the counting house and stood there while a clerk read it twice. The claim was dropped that afternoon. That night Thomas came home with a receipt book he had bought in Derby for 4 shillings and 6pence, leather, brass at the clasp, and he put it into her hands across the kitchen table. "Numbers do not lie for anybody, Nell," he said. "They only lie for whoever writes them." She wrote in that book for 9 years. He died on the 2nd of August, 1859. He had been 4 days on the road in wet weather, hauling brick to a job at Barton, and he came home with a cough and was dead inside a fortnight. At 38, and the doctor took a guinea and said it was the chest. There had been one child, a boy, in 1853, who lived 9 days. What followed was ordinary and fast. The horses went at the October sale at Horninglow and fetched less than they should have, because everyone in the trade knew why they were selling. The wagons went to a man from Uttoxeter. By the middle of October there was nothing left of 9 years of carting except a room on Anderstaff Lane at 2 shillings and 3pence a week, a box of clothes, the receipt book, and one debt still standing on the paper. That debt was owed by a beer merchant named Cuthbert Rowe, bankrupt in June, owing money all over 3 counties. Roe owed Thomas Hargreaves £96 and 4 shillings for cartage, run up over 2 years, while he promised to settle at the quarter and never once did. Eleanor had chased it 11 times in writing, and she had the copies. The creditors met on a Wednesday, the 19th of October, in an upstairs room at the Anchor in High Street, with rain on the window and a fire that would not draw. There were 6 men in that room, and Eleanor. The man handling the estate was Ambrose Vale, 53, thin and careful, with an ink stain on his second finger that never washed off, and he read the schedule of assets in a voice like a man reading a weather report. There was nothing to distribute. By the time the secured creditors were satisfied, there would be, Mr. Vale said, a shilling in the pound at best. Then he came to the last item, and 2 of the men were smiling before he read it out. Black Mere Brewery. At the edge of the parish on the Burton Road, 1 brewhouse, 1 malt house, a cooper's shed, a loading yard, a stable, a pump house, a cellar, and about 1 3/4 acres of land, taken by Roe in 1856 against a bad debt and never once used by him. Shut since 1852, offered twice at auction, and withdrawn both times for want of a bid. Let the widow have it, said a maltster named Wardle, who was 60 and red in the face and enjoying himself. She can keep her horses in it. Somebody said she had no horses left, and that was funnier still. Eleanor waited until they were done. Then she asked 2 questions, and she asked them in the order she would have asked them of any account. What rates were owing on it, and was the title clean? Mr. Vale looked at his papers longer than he needed to. £11 and 14 shillings in arrears to the parish, he said. Title good, no mortgage on it, no claim against it. She said she would take it. It cost her £2 and 9 shillings in stamp and transfer to receive a thing no man in that room would have carried home for nothing, and she did not have it. So she borrowed it from Bess Tandy, 55, who kept the lodging house on Anderstaff Lane and had been bringing her bread and dripping twice a week since August, without once being asked. Mr. Vale gave her the deed in a tin box and the keys on a ring, and the largest of them was 9 inches of iron and orange, with rust all down one side. She walked out to it on the Saturday morning, the 22nd of October, which was 2 miles and a bit along the Burton Road, with the wind coming across the flat ground off the river. Black Mere sat back from the road behind a wall that had come down in 2 places, on the corner where an old wagon track ran off toward the gravel pits. The gate was chained, but the chain was not locked, only wound twice round the post, and it came away in her hands and left a brown line of rust across her palm. The yard had grass growing up between the sets and a water trough with a dead ash sapling in it. The brewhouse stood on the north side. Red brick, 3 stories, with a stone let into the wall above the door that said 1821. Half the slates were off the east end of the roof. The birds had been in for years, and the floor under the hole was white with it. Inside, the copper was gone. She knew what she was looking at even without knowing the trade, because the shape of it was still there. A round brick setting, with a ring of pale, unweathered brick where the vessel had sat, 11 bolt holes in the floor, and a stub of pipe cut off clean about 4 inches from the wall. Somebody had taken it out carefully, the way you take out a thing you mean to sell rather than a thing you mean to smash. The mash tun was gone the same way. The wooden vessels in the room above had dried and sprung. The malt house was worse. The sacks left in it had gone down into a black mold that had grown into the floorboards, and there was a smell in there that got into her clothes and stayed until she washed them. The cooper's shed had lost its roof, and a shaving horse stood in the middle of it in the weather beside a stack of iron hoops rusted into one solid piece. The stable still had harness on the pegs, green with mold, stiff as board. The pump house was a small brick building at the western end, with its slate roof still whole. The pump inside was a heavy old thing with a wheel and a handle, and the handle would not move an inch, not with her weight on it and both hands. The channel running from it toward the field was choked with leaves and silt. She went round all of it twice, then sat on the mounting block with the receipt book open on her knee and wrote down what she had. Slate, about 200 hole on the west roof. Lead flashing off the brewhouse gutters. Iron, in hoops and bands in the pump itself. Oak in the malt house roof, sound in the middle bays. Brick, which nobody would buy, because there were 3 brickyards inside 4 miles. 3 doors worth taking. She reckoned £35 if she paid men to take it apart properly, and perhaps 22 if she sold it standing to a dealer. Against that, there was £11, 14 in rates. She wrote both figures down and sat looking at them. And a man named Silas Wren, 70, who walked to the end of the road and back every morning of his life, for reasons nobody ever asked about, went past and lifted his hat to her. Here is the thing worth holding on to, before she goes any further into that yard. Every person in Burton could tell you why Black Mere had closed. The well failed. They said it, the way you say a date. But a brewery is worth nothing without water, and a dead well is worth nothing to anybody. So tell me this in the comments as we go. If the water under that ground had truly given out 7 years ago, why had the men who stripped the copper out of the brewhouse and sold the mash tun and carried off the doors never once gone down into the cellar and taken what was there? Because Eleanor was about to go down, and there were 31 casks under that floor. The story came to her that afternoon from Martha Dean, 41, who kept a beer house half a mile back toward the town and gave her a cup of tea and the whole history for nothing. Black Mere had been built by a family called Ashby, and the last of them was Henry Ashby, who took it on in 1840 and ran it small and steady for 12 years. Then in the summer of 1852 the water went bad. That was how Martha Dean put it, with complete confidence, because she had heard nothing else for 7 years. The well failed, the ale spoiled. Ashby could not brew, and Ashby went under. He closed at Michaelmas, sold what he could, and died in a cottage at Newton Solney in 57, 61 years old, without ever working again. Everything at Burton is the water, Martha Dean said. Take the water off a brewery, and you have a barn. Eleanor asked whether anyone had tried the well since. Nobody had. There was no reason to. And that was the thing she turned over on the walk back and could not put down. Nobody had ever tried it. So the only proof anyone had that the water was bad was that everybody said so. She went back on the Monday with a lantern, 2 buckets she borrowed from Bess Tandy, and the chalk out of her pocket, which she carried because she had marked wagon loads with it for 9 years. The cellar door was at the north end of the yard, sunk down 3 steps. Oak, with iron bands across it. The big key turned hard, and then turned. The air that came up was cold and clean, and smelled of brick and old wood and nothing else, which surprised her, because she had expected the malt house smell. The steps went down 11 treads, worn into hollows in the middle. The cellar ran the whole length under the brewhouse, barrel vaulted in brick, dry underfoot, with 2 low arches going off to the sides, and it was in far better condition than anything above ground. The casks stood in 2 rows on wooden stillions along the walls, with more stacked on their sides at the far end, and one standing alone in the corner beyond them. She counted them, and wrote the number in the book. 31. Then she took the mallet she had borrowed, and started at the near end. Because iron hoops sold at 8 shillings the hundredweight, and staves were worth something to a cooper if the wood was sound, and she needed to know what she had before she asked a dealer for a price. The first cask sounded like a drum. So did the second, and the third, and the 6 after that. She went along the north wall, knocking each one twice, once high and once low, writing in the book whether the staves were sound or sprung, and whether the hoops were worth lifting, and every one of them answered her the same way, which is the way an empty thing answers. She crossed to the south wall and did it again. Hollow, 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 hollow. The stacked ones at the far end took longer. She caught her sleeve on a nailhead and tore it. And she stopped to look at the tear the way you do when you own 3 sleeves in the world. 30 of them were empty. The last one stood by itself in the corner beyond the stack, upright on its end instead of lying on its side like every other cask in the room. It was a hogshead, black with age, with heavy iron hoops on it. 4 above and 4 below the bilge. She knocked it high and got nothing much. She knocked it low, down near the floor, and the sound came back flat and dead and short. Thud. She stood there with the mallet in her hand and did not move for a while. She put her shoulder against it and pushed, the way you rock a cask to hear what is in it. And it did not rock. It did not shift. A hogshead that will not rock is either bolted down or heavy. And she had spent 9 years knowing exactly what things weighed. Empty. That cask was 80 pounds of oak and iron, and a strong man could walk it across a floor on its rim. Full. It was better than 600 pounds. And no man alive was carrying 600 pounds down 11 worn steps in the dark. So either somebody had filled it where it stood, or somebody had wanted it to stay exactly where it was. There was a cock in the head near the bottom. Brass. Gone green. She could not turn it with her hands, so she went up to the yard for the lard she used on her boots, worked it into the thread, ate her bread on the mounting block while it took, and came down and turned it. It ran, not ale. Not the black, stinking sludge she had half expected out of a cask that had stood 7 years in the dark. What came out was water, and it was clear enough to read through, and it was so cold that her hand ached inside a minute, and it kept running, and it did not slow. She put her face to it. It smelled of nothing at all. No hop, no yeast, no sourness. She wet her finger and tasted, and it had the faint, hard edge that well water has in that country, a little bitter at the back, and it left her mouth dry after. She filled both buckets, carried them up the steps, tipped them out in the yard, came down and filled them again, and did that 9 times. Then the flow began to thin, and she did it 4 times more with the buckets half filling, and the cock gave a cough of air and ran to a trickle and stopped. Something near 54 gallons. By the size of it. She wrote the figure in the book, with the date. Then she took her chalk and drew a line across the head of the cask and wrote the date under it, the 24th of October, and drew a second mark across the joint of the cellar door and the frame, low down where a man's eye would not go, because she had marked wagons that way for years when she wanted to know whether a tarpaulin had been lifted on the road. She locked the door. She put the key in her pocket and walked the 2 miles home in the dark and was in bed by 9. She came back at 8 the next morning. There had been no rain in the night. The mud outside the cellar door held her own boot prints from the day before, and nothing else. The chalk mark across the door joint was unbroken. She unlocked it, went down, and turned the cock. It ran full and cold, the same as it had the first time, and it kept running, and she stood holding an empty bucket and watched it fill. A brewery that had been shut for 7 years, on ground that every man in the county had been told was finished, had just produced the one thing that the whole town of Burton was built on. She did not know that yet. She knew only that a cask nobody could move was making water she could not account for, under a building she had been given because it was worthless, and that she had 2 pounds and 9 shillings of borrowed money standing against her name. The gig came on the Wednesday. It turned into her yard as if it had been there before, and the man who got down from it was about 44, dressed better than anyone had dressed in that yard in a decade, and he gave her a card that said, Josiah Nettle, Melling and Croft, Brewers, Burton-on-Trent. Melling and Croft was a large house on the other side of the town, 40,000 barrels a year. Eleanor had carted for them twice, years back, and been paid slowly. Mr. Nettle was pleasant about it. He had heard the property had changed hands. His firm wanted ground on that side of the parish for a store and a stable yard, nothing more grand, and Black Mere was awkwardly placed for anyone but them. They would take it as it stood, buildings and land and whatever rubbish was in it, and pay £180. She had been standing there 20 minutes earlier, working out whether 22 pounds of scrap would cover the rates. She said she would need to think. He said of course. And then he asked his questions. And it was the questions that stopped her. Because Eleanor Hargreaves had spent 9 years reading invoices, and on an invoice, the order of the items tells you what the man cared about when he wrote it. He did not ask about the acreage, or the road frontage, or the state of the roof, or whether the malt house floor would carry a load, which is what a man asks if he means to store goods in a place. He asked whether the cellar was dry. He asked how deep it ran and whether the side arches were open or bricked. He asked whether anything had been taken out of it since she had the keys. And when she said she had sold nothing yet, he said that was very sensible. And he said it too quickly. Then he said the offer would hold until the 15th of November, and that his firm would want it exactly as it stood, with no clearing and no works of any kind done to it beforehand. And he got back into the gig. She got the first answer wrong, and it cost her 9 shillings and 4 pence and 4 days she could not spare. Her theory was rain, and any practical person would have reached it. Above the western end of the cellar ran the old drainage channel from the pump house, choked to the top with leaf and silt. And if that channel had backed up over 7 winters, then water goes where water goes, which is down, and a cask standing under a cracked cistern could fill from a joint in the head with nobody the wiser. So she hired 2 men. Alfred Coates, 19, out of regular work since the spring, and Michael Ruddock, 38, a laborer, slow and thorough, who would take no less than 1 shilling and 6 pence a day, and said so before he picked anything up. In 3 days they cleared the channel from the pump house to the field ditch and lifted the ground above the western corner of the cellar down to the top of the brick vault. The vault was sound. No crack, no pipe, no cistern, nothing but clay and gravel and 1 horseshoe. Eleanor paid them 9 shillings and 4 pence, wrote it in the book, and went down that evening and turned the cock, and it ran cold and full and clean, the way it had every time. It did not rain between the 26th of October and the 4th of November, 11 dry days. She drew that cask down to the last trickle 4 times in those 11 days, and 4 times it came back to the same place, and by the end of it she had thrown away her only reasonable explanation and had nothing to put in its place. What she had instead were 2 small things she had written down without knowing why. The first was a crust. Under the lowest iron hoop there was a line of something pale and hard, white going to gray, thin as a fingernail, which did not scrape off easily and was on none of the other 30 casks. The second was the floor. The bricks directly under that cask were cold, in a way the rest of the cellar was not, and they held a dampness that never dried. She laid a sheet of clean paper on them one evening under a slate, and in the morning the paper was limp and dark, and the slate had beads on the underside. On the 6th of November she went into Burton and found the cooper. His name was Samuel Pike. He was 61, and he worked at a cooperage in Wetmore Road. He had been a cooper at Black Mere for 19 years, from 1833 until the day it shut, and when she told him where she was from, his face went to nothing at all, and he asked her twice to say the name again. He did not want to come. She offered him 5 shillings for a Sunday, and he stood looking at the shavings on the floor, and then he said he would come, and he said it like a man agreeing to a thing he had decided against. He came on the Sunday morning in a good coat. He went down the 11 steps ahead of her with the lantern, and he stopped at the bottom and looked along the 2 rows of casks the way you look at a room you used to live in. He knew the cellar. He named the stillions. He put his hand flat on one of the sprung casks and said he had put that one together in 1848 and that the wood had been bad from the yard, and he had said so at the time. Then he came to the corner. He stood in front of the hogshead for a long moment and did not touch it. "That is not one of mine," he said. He crouched and ran his thumb along the crust under the bottom hoop. "The hoops were wrong," he said. "A hogshead wants iron of a certain weight and no more, because iron costs money, and a cooper does not put a shilling of iron where a penny will do, And whoever had hooped that cask had used bands you would put on a vat standing out in a yard. The head was too new for the staves. They tried to move it, and they might as well have pushed the wall. He worked a chisel down beside the foot and struck it. And it went in an inch and stopped hard. And when he pulled it out, there was gray mortar on the blade. "It is set in," he said. "The chime is bedded. Somebody mortared this cask to the floor. She wanted it up." He told her to leave it. She fetched the crowbar anyway and put it under the bottom hoop and leaned on it, and there was a crack, like a shot in that vaulted room, and a stave split from the foot up about 10 inches, and she stood back, expecting the whole 54 gallons to come out across the bricks. It did not. What came was a slow, steady seep, and it did not come out of the split. It came up through the joint at the bottom, from underneath, out of the floor, and it went on coming after the cask had been drawn dry an hour before. Samuel Pike sat down on the step and said nothing for a while. Then he said he had been told when he left that place never to speak of the cellar to anybody, and that he had been paid for it, and that he had kept his word 7 years and did not care to break it on a Sunday for 5 shillings. She did not push him. She wrote down what he had said, word for word, with the date. Then she went to the papers. They had come with the property in the tin box and in a trunk in the counting house, and most of it was ruined, gone to mold in a room with a bad window. But the ledgers were bound and heavy, and the middle of them was legible, and she sat in that cold room on the 11th of November, with a candle, and worked back through the last 4 years of Henry Ashby's business, the way she would have worked a disputed cartage account. The brewery ceased trading at Michaelmas, 1852. Every entry after that was the winding up of a dead concern. Wages settled. Coal sold off. A horse sold. The copper sold in January 1853 for £140 to a firm at Wolverhampton. And then, in March 1853, 6 months after the place had supposedly lost its water and closed its doors, there was this, in the same clerk's hand as everything else, number 3 well. New lining and mason's work. £7 12 shillings. Paid Nathaniel Gorse. In June 1853 there was another. Well number 3. Brickwork completed. £4 even. Gorse again. In April 1854 there was a payment for a bucket and chain and for work in the pump house, £2 and 8. She wrote the 3 entries out on a clean page in her own hand, with the dates, and totaled them, because she wanted the number in front of her. £14. £14 spent on a well, over 2 years, at a brewery that had closed because its well had failed, by a man so far down with his creditors that he had sold his copper to pay them. There was one more account in the world that covered those years, and it was hers. She got out her own wagon books, the ones she had kept for Thomas since 1850, and worked forward from the closure the way she had worked back through Ashby's. It took her most of a night. She found it on a Tuesday in May, 1853. 2 loads. Lime and brick. Burton to Black Mere. 8 miles the round trip, 12 shillings the pair. Carted by Thomas Hargreaves, and paid by a mason named Gorse. Her husband had hauled building material to a brewery that had been shut for 8 months, and she had written the invoice for it herself and thought nothing of it at the time, because a carter carts what he is paid to cart. On the back of the second invoice, in pencil, in Thomas's square, careful hand, there was one line. He had not shown it to her. He had not spoken of it. He had written it the way a man writes something down so that he can stop carrying it about in his head. They are paying to hide water they claim does not exist. She sat with that piece of paper in her hands in a cold room at 11 at night. And she read it perhaps 30 times. And then she put it flat inside the receipt book with the brass clasp, and did not go to bed at all. Samuel Pike came out to Black Mere again on the Thursday. She had sent him no money and made him no promise. He came because she had sent him the 3 ledger entries, copied out in her own writing. They stood in the yard first, and she asked him a question she should have asked in October, which was why Melling and Croft would pay £180 for a ruin they said they wanted for a stable yard. Samuel Pike looked at her the way a tradesman looks at somebody who has come to the trade late. He said that in Burton you could buy anything, brick and slate and timber, a copper of any size out of any of 6 foundries, a mash tun second-hand every month of the year, coopers, men, and a name over a door if you were patient. There was one thing in that town not for sale at any price, and it was not above the ground. The whole trade there, he said, sat on the water. The wells at Burton had something in them that the wells at other places did not. Some hardness out of the ground itself. And what it did was make the pale ales keep and clear and travel, and that was why the brewing had come to a small market town on the Trent and stayed there and doubled again. He said a man in that town who owned a good well owned the only part of a brewery that could not be carried away on a cart. They stripped this place to the brick, he said, and they left the cellar shut. You want to think about why? They went down at 10 in the morning with 2 lanterns, a saw, a chisel, a cold set, a hammer, and a bucket. Samuel cut the hoops. He did it properly, in order, the way a cooper takes a cask apart when he means to know what is in it. And the iron came off in bands and rang on the bricks. Then he lifted out the head, and they held the lanterns over the open top of it and looked down. The cask had no bottom. It was a shell. The staves ran down and ended in a collar of brickwork and mortar set into the floor, and below that there was nothing to see but a slab of stone with a hole cut through it. And in the hole there was water, standing about 4 feet down and perfectly still, and holding the light like a coin. Samuel put the chisel to the mortar, and it came away easier than it should have, because it had been laid wet in a hurry, and in half an hour they had the collar off and the slab levered aside on the crowbar. Underneath was a well, not a cavern, not a vault, not a stair going down into anything. It was a plain brick well shaft about 3 feet 6 across, lined with newer brick for the first 8 or 9 courses, and older brick below that, with an iron ring set into the curb, and the stub of a lead pipe coming in at the side with a wooden plug driven into it. The pipe ran off toward the pump house. It had been cut and stopped, and the cut was clean, and the plug was oak, and it was sound. The water stood 4 feet below the curb, and while they were still on their knees looking at it, Eleanor watched the level come up over the line of damp on the brick, where she had drawn the cask down the evening before. Samuel Pike sat back on the floor of the cellar with his arms on his knees. He said the well was called Number 3 and had been sunk deeper than the other 2 in 1847, and that it had been the best water on the property and everybody who worked there knew it. He said Henry Ashby had paid him £3 in the November of 1852, after the men were let go and the gates were chained, to fit a false head and a bottomless shell over the top of it, and mortar it down, and hoop it heavy, so that it would not be shifted, and to make the cellar look like a cellar full of empty casks. He said Ashby had stood where Eleanor was standing and had said 11 words to him, and Samuel repeated them exactly, because he had been carrying them about for 7 years. Say nothing while I am living, and nothing after I am gone. And then Samuel told her the rest of it, which was not a crime and not a conspiracy, and was, in the end, only the ordinary way a small man loses to a large one. Ashby had not lost his water in 1852. He had lost his money. He had borrowed against the brewery twice, badly, to sink the deeper well, and to build his trade out toward Derby, and by the summer of '52 his creditors were on him. A larger house offered him a figure for the whole property that was an insult, and when he would not take it, there began to be talk in the trade and in the beer houses that the water at Black Mere had gone off, and the ale was spoiling, and Ashby was finished. There was no proof of it. There did not have to be. In a town where every man's living came out of the ground, the rumor did the work of a fact. And inside 4 months, his customers had gone, and his credit was shut. So he closed, and sold his copper and his horses, and paid what he could. And before the receivers came, he put his best asset under a barrel and mortared it down, so that the men who had told the town his water was dead would go on believing it. He kept paying Gorse to line and mend that well for 2 years after he had stopped being able to use it. 14 pounds. It was the only thing he had left that nobody could take off him. And he had gone on tending it the way a man tends a grave. Josiah Nettle came back on the 20th of November. And this time, he did not talk about a stable yard. He offered 450 pounds. Nothing about the property had altered since October. The roof was still open at the East End, and the copper was still in Wolverhampton. The only thing in the world that had changed between 180 pounds and 450 was that a widow had taken a mallet to 31 casks and had not sold the place before she did it. She thanked him and said no, and she wrote the offer down in the receipt book with the date and the figure and his name, because an offer refused is worth keeping when the man who made it is not finished with you. He was not finished with her. The first letter came from a solicitor in Lichfield on the 2nd of December. The wagon track running off the Burton Road across the north corner of the Black Mere land belonged to Melling and Croft, it said, having come to them with the gravel workings in 1855, and any carting over it was a trespass which would be resisted. Without that track there was no way to bring a loaded wagon into the yard at all. It was a good move against a woman with no money for lawyers. It was a poor move against a woman with 9 years of wagon books. Eleanor sat down with her own accounts and with Ashby's, and inside 3 days she had it. Thomas had carted over that track 81 times between 1850 and 1859, never once challenged and never once charged a toll, and every load was dated and signed. Ashby's ledgers showed carting over it from 1841. Samuel Pike would swear to it, and so would 2 old Black Mere men, Joseph Hallam, 64, and Walter Dace, 58, who had loaded wagons on that corner every working day of their lives. She had it copied out fair by a clerk for 6 shillings and sent to the solicitor in Lichfield. And she never heard from him again about the track. The other moves were smaller and meaner, and there was no answering some of them. Wardle the maltster, who had been so amusing in the upstairs room at the Anchor, would not sell her malt at any price, and neither would the 2 men he traded with. She bought her malt out of Derby instead, and paid 1 9 a quarter more for it, and the carriage on top. The parish pressed her for the £11.14 in arrears in the same week, which she thought was a coincidence for about a day. The cooperage in Wetmore Road told Samuel Pike that a man of his years ought to think about where his wages came from. Samuel gave them his notice on the 9th of December. Meanwhile, Eleanor had written 4 letters, and none of them went to anybody in Burton. They went to brewing firms in Nottingham, Leicester, Sheffield, and Manchester, and each said the same thing in 11 lines. She had a well at Burton, not in use, lined in 1853, on freehold ground she owned outright, and she would have the water drawn and tested in front of any man they cared to send. 3 of them did not answer. The 4th sent Reuben Alder. Mr. Alder was 49 and ran Alder and Son of Nottingham with his brother, and had spent 2 years looking for a way into Burton water without paying Burton prices for it. He came on the 3rd of January and would not take her word for anything, which she liked. He went down into the cellar himself, watched the water drawn from the open well, filled 2 jars with his own hands, sealed them with wax, took one away and left the other in her keeping. The report came back on the 29th of January from a man in Nottingham who tested waters for the trade. Eleanor could not read most of it. The part she could read said that the water from the well at Black Mere was hard, was heavy in the salts that brewers of pale ale looked for, and stood comparison with the best of the wells then working in the town. She did not take that report to a courtroom. She did not accuse anybody of anything. She had it read aloud in her own yard. On the 8th of February, at 11 in the morning, in front of Reuben Alder and his clerk, Ambrose Vale, the estate agent, who charged her a guinea to attend and witness the papers, Samuel Pike, Joseph Hallam, Walter Dace, and a reporter from the county paper. She had the deed on the table, the ledger open at the Gorse entries, and Thomas's invoice with the pencil line on the back, and she let the whole of it be said out loud where anyone could hear it. Edmund Croft came himself. He was 58, and he arrived after it had started, and stood at the back, with his hat in his hand. When it was done, he asked, quite politely, whether he might see the cellar, and Eleanor said he might. He went down the 11 steps behind Samuel's lantern. He stood in the corner where the hogshead had been, and looked at the open curb of number 3 well and the water standing in it, 4 feet down and rising, clear enough to read through. He looked at it for perhaps a minute and a half. He did not ask a question, and he did not make an offer. Then he came up the steps, put his hat on in the yard, said good morning to Mr. Vale, and went out through the gate to his carriage. The agreement with Alder and Son was signed on the 22nd of February, 1860. Eleanor did not sell one brick of Black Mere. She granted them the right to draw water from the well for 7 years at £60 a year, paid half yearly in advance, up to a stated quantity a week, the carting to be done by them, the well to remain hers, and to be worked by her at any time for her own brewing. Against that agreement, and against the freehold, she borrowed £200 from a bank in High Street at 5%, which took her 3 visits, and Mr. Vale's signature beside her own, and which she would not have got in October if she had gone in there and asked for 10. The money went into the roof first, and it went faster than she expected. 240 slates, and the battens to hang them on. A carpenter named Edwin Nash, 36, and his brother, 11 days on the east end of the brewhouse at 3 shillings and 6 pence a day the pair. New glass in 19 windows at 9 pence a pane. The pump house rebuilt round the old pump, which turned out to want nothing but a new bucket, new leathers, and a week of oil. A second-hand copper of 30 barrels bought out of a brewery closing at Uttoxeter for £85, brought over on 2 wagons, and set on Ashby's old brickwork, which fitted it to within 2 inches. She hired a brewer, because she was not one, and never pretended to be. Owen Pratt was 52, and had been out of a place since the house he worked for cut back in 58, and he came for 30 shillings a week and the use of the cottage by the gate. The first brew was thrown away. They ran it in the last week of June, 1860, into casks that had stood dry in that cellar for 8 years. Samuel had told her they wanted more soaking than they had been given, and Owen Pratt had said it would do, and Eleanor had let the man she was paying 30 shillings a week decide. 9 barrels came out sour enough that Pratt would not have it near a customer. They ran the whole 9 into the drain in the yard on a Tuesday morning, and stood watching it go, and it was £11 and some shillings of malt and hops and coal and wages going down the channel Alfred Coates had dug out the autumn before. They soaked the casks 4 days, and did it again in the 2nd week of July, and that one was right. The first order out of Black Mere in 8 years went to George Twigg of the Wheat Sheaf at Tutbury, who took 9 hogsheads at 42 shillings, the hogshead on the 3rd of August, 1860, and paid cash on delivery because he had known Thomas Hargreaves, and said so twice. By the October after that, Black Mere brewed twice a week, and no more. It stayed a small house. Owen Pratt, Samuel Pike back in the cooper's shed with the roof on it again, Joseph Hallam and Walter Dace on the floor, Alfred Coates driving the 1 wagon, 14 public houses out toward Tutbury and Sudbury took the ale, and Alder and Son took their water every week and paid on the day. Eleanor kept the books. She kept them the same way she had kept them for a carting firm, in a hand a clerk could read, with the tallies written up on the same night the load went out. The hogshead in the corner of the cellar was never broken up. Samuel put the staves back together round a new bottom and a new head, and stood it beside the well with the hoops on it loose, and it held nothing at all, and never did again. The men used it to set a lantern on. On a cold morning in the last week of October, 1860, Eleanor came up the Burton Road at 7 with the frost still on the wall, and saw steam going up out of the vent in the brewhouse roof, straight up in the still air, for the first time since Michaelmas 1852. Eleanor Hargreaves was 33 years old. 15 months earlier, she had been a widow in a lodging house with a box of clothes, owed £96 and 4 shillings that she never received and never will, and 6 men in an upstairs room had laughed while they signed over to her, the one thing among all their assets that none of them had bothered to walk across and look at. She had not found treasure. There was no treasure in it. The well had been there the whole time, under the same floor, under the same barrel, in the same cellar. The men who stripped that place had crossed 100 times, and everything that changed about its worth was what somebody finally knew about it. Her husband had put a receipt book into her hands 9 years before and told her that numbers do not lie for anybody, that they only lie for whoever writes them. She had taken it at the time to mean a merchant with 14 sacks on his conscience. It turned out to mean more than that. A whole town had believed for 7 years that the water under Black Mere was dead, and not one man in it had ever tested that water because the people who wrote the story down had wanted it told that way. Of all the debts that were ever owed to Eleanor Hargreaves, the only one that ever got paid came to her in a rusted key and a laugh, and there was not a coin in it anywhere.